welcome this next look at land, water, and agriculture. So joining us is Governor Bruce Babbitt, former governor of Arizona, Secretary of the Interior, and as we were reminded, a one-time presidential candidate. Jim Holway, who is the director of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy. And joining us remotely, welcome Naveen. Naveen Sikka, who is CEO of Terviva, which we're going to hear about, is a ag tech venture that might hold some solutions. Moderating the panel is Michael Grunwald, late of Politico. He is the perfect monitor. He is working on a book right now about feeding the world and while saving the planet. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks. Can you hear? It's good? Awesome. I thought since it came up a little bit in the last session, I thought I'd just start by asking, you guys can guess, since we talked a lot about urbanization, the suburbs, the exurbs, the universities, it's all taking up land. There are these incredible land disputes. How much of our land on Earth do you think is taken up by us, by our cities, our civilization? What percentage?
Speak.
15, 30? 1%. 1%. By 2050, it might be 2%, which is a long-winded way of saying, really, the Earth is its farms and its nature, mostly pastures and nature. But the future land competition, with all due respect to all of us who have spent a lot of time thinking about these urban issues, it really is going to be about agriculture, which, as many of you know, is the largest user of fresh water. It's going to be a competition between ag and nature. We do still have to feed the world, though. If on the current trend, if you look at population, we're going to have nearly 10 billion people by 2050. And we're going to need about 20 quadrillion calories. Right now, we produce about 13 quadrillion. So that means we're going to need to increase agriculture. Is going to have to produce an additional, comes out to about the equivalent of 800 Olive Garden breadsticks per person per year. Additional, if we continue our yield trends. So in other words, it's going to be really hard. We're going to need a lot more food. And for all the reasons we heard during the last panel, we're also going to need a lot more nature to store the carbon to save us. Which is a long way of saying that land really matters. So I thought we'd start by letting Secretary Babbitt, if you could give us the overview of the land competition globally, nationally, Arizonally, if you could give us the 10,000-foot view.
Thanks, Mike. I think I'll pass on a global view and modestly try to just give you the American West and specifically the basin of the Colorado River, which is the 5th largest river in the United States. The flow of that river is mainly about irrigated agriculture. Now, you need to bear in mind that the river is fully utilized. The Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean. It is entirely diverted by an enormous system of dams which provide irrigated agriculture. 75% of the water used in the basin is irrigated agriculture. Now, climate change has arrived with a vengeance across the Colorado River Basin. We are in the midst of a sustained, multi-decade drought, which is now permanent. That's a complicated issue, which I will leave to the hydrologists, but the relationship between climate change and land is going to put a shifting pattern of land use and agriculture everywhere in the United States and in the world. But in this particular basin, the shifting pattern is called drought. It is here to stay. The river now has declined by about 20% in the last 100 years, and we can now predict that for each degree Celsius of temperature increase driven by global warming, the flow of the river will decline by 9% indefinitely, as long as climate change is upon us, which it clearly is. Now, what does that do for agriculture? There are 4 million acres of irrigated agriculture in the 7 states and Mexico. 4 million acres. The river is already declined by 20%, fully used. And we've been living off the storage that's accumulated in Lake Mead, Lake Powell, and the big reservoirs, which are now approaching what's known as dead pool, the point at which they are no longer part of the water supply. Now, if you add those figures, you get an inescapable conclusion that of the 4 million acres of irrigated agriculture in the 7 states and Mexico of the Colorado River Basin, 1 million acres of agriculture have to be taken out of production. 1 million acres. The process is already underway in its beginning stages, and it's not a happy process. You can see it in southern Arizona, where random reductions are made in small agricultural communities, pretty much as a function of a lot of legal complexities as to who has to give up the water first, or who has the least secure water rights. And you can go out on the land and see these communities, most of them small communities dedicated to irrigation agriculture, beginning to become ghost towns. Now, for the purpose of water, land use, agriculture, and people on the land, the interesting and important question, it seems to me, is do you let 1 million acres disappear to vacant land and populated by ghost towns? Or do we have the capacity as planners to think of a better way to reduce the footprint of irrigated agriculture by 1 million acres? We've tried it from the top down as this process begins, and we've largely failed. I include myself as the former water master at the federal level of this river, as one of those who thought that the political leaders could solve this problem from the top down. And what we have met in communities across the basin is pretty much what Brian Goldman was talking about in terms of sea level rise. He was saying back in 2010, we had a lot of ideas and nothing happened. And we're at that stage now in the Colorado River Basin. We have tried various top-down solutions, mainly mandates from the top. And it's an agonizing process to get out on the land and see communities which are threatened with extinction. You can imagine their reaction to a federal official coming to town and saying, we're telling you to leave, and how you're going to leave. We are at the very beginning now of a more promising alternative. You can see it in the state of Colorado, where after these failures, the governor and the legislature have set in process a discussion across the entire basin involving every community in which the discussion is now starting. Here are the facts. Here is the reduction that's necessary, and we've got to talk. How are we going to spread the reductions? Rather than wiping out one unfortunate community whose rights are insecure, can we spread reductions in irrigated water use across an entire state, the largest impacted state in the basin? Who's going to pay for it? What kinds of compensation modes should there be? It's kind of a given that people expect that when generations have been on the land and all of a sudden it's not there. How do we spread it? That conversation is just beginning, and it seems to me it's an example that needs careful attention, because we're talking about, rather than random sort of law of the jungle, we're talking about, can we mobilize a community response, a multi-community response, spread across an entire state? It's underway. We're decades late, but I think that this may be a model for how we reorganize and scale down agriculture, irrigated agriculture, in those places where it's necessary. There are other places where we can do the opposite, and that is scale up. But I've used my time, so quit.
Well, let's since Jim has worked on many of these same issues in the West, let's drill down on this a little bit, because like that's a million acres that are going bye-bye. You're seeing some of the same things. There's talk in the Central Valley of another 1 million acres that's running out of groundwater. And people, it's easy to kind of, why are they irrigating the desert anyway? But this is some of the most efficient agriculture in the world, right? If they replace it in the Southern Hemisphere, it might require 3 million acres. How do you sort of mediate? We heard about the consensus building in the past. How are you going to sort of deal with these different stakeholders who have and larger community needs, which are not only about, the world needs water, the cities need water, the environment needs water, but also the world needs food?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and certainly appreciate the table that Bruce has set for us here. That we could easily spend, well, at least Bruce and I could spend the rest of today and tomorrow just on this topic, and I know we don't have that kind of time. But it's certainly an honor to have all of you here and be able to speak with you, be here in person, as others have said, and I always love being on panels together and having time with Bruce Babbitt. I spent the first part of my career basically for the state of Arizona implementing the Groundwater Management Act that Governor Babbitt got adopted, and now that I'm at the what I might think of as the legacy-setting stage of my career, I get to build the Babbitt Center that we named in honor of Bruce Babbitt for all of his work. But clearly we have very serious challenges. Maybe a big picture thing that we might come back to is one of the biggest challenges we have is our inability to come together as a society and make any decision about anything. If we can't solve that, we will not solve this. But one other hope I would lay out is water has typically been a place where we do manage to come together. And if we get into this some today or in conversations on the side, we can talk about some of the ability the West is showing now and has shown historically to come together and resolve their water issues. I won't say it's not political. It's intensely political, but it is stakeholder politics. Cities versus mines, this city versus that city, upper basin versus lower basin. That is a whole lot easier to deal with than partisan politics. And one of the things we really have to work on and could use your help extensively as our organ of communication to the public is let's make sure this does not become a partisan issue, because we're toast if it does. And as we figure out how to lead our way out of these issues with water, will we set an example that can help us communicate on other equally controversial or even more third rail issues than water? But water's pretty third rail. I'm reminded of the expression, I was telling Bruce about this earlier, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. Falsely attributed to Mark Twain. I must admit at one point I dug into this after the John Fleck book came out. And as I told Bruce, the earliest reference I can find to that term being used was Governor Bruce Babbitt testifying to Congress in the late 70s. I don't think Bruce is claiming credit for this, but that's the first example I can find.
I'm
Anyway.
not a prohibitionist.
And we're more into tequila and mezcal out in the Southwest than whiskey anyway, but anyway, a whole other story. Anyway, but to your point here, and actually if we could bring up the slides, I'll sort of, I'll dance across a couple of issues. Do I need to hit something, or there they are there? Okay, we lost our other speaker for the moment. Okay, so just so you see the geography, there's the Colorado Basin in the 7 Southwest states and the 2 states of Mexico. And what I wanted to highlight first here is if you see what just got circled, these are the areas that are not within the watershed basin, but where much of the water goes. The whole Denver Front Range, all of Southern California, Salt Lake City area. So when we talk about the basin and the 43 million people today it serves, half of them live outside the basin but are hydrologically connected to us by these extensive plumbing structure. Just to briefly illustrate the nature of this agriculture, which is, as you would expect, widely variable across these multiple states. So the circle to the right there's your central Arizona. Phoenix is at the top of it, Tucson's below it. If the Colorado River is the example of where we are first seeing climate change come to rest in a highly significant way, at least other than seacoast and sea level rise, but I might even say this might be more immediate at the moment than sea level rise, central Arizona is ground zero for what's going on the Colorado River. The agricultural use that's been going on for many years is really what drove Arizona to want to build the Central Arizona Project and bring its water into the state so that we could get them off of groundwater they were mining and onto an alternative supply. They are now losing that alternative supply, and we are funding $80 million in wells so they can go back on their groundwater. But even with that, best case scenario, 40% of the land goes out of production. Best case scenario, 40% of the land goes out of production. If we move to the larger circle to the left, here's the most senior water rights on the Colorado River. This is the Imperial Irrigation District and the Coachella Irrigation District in California. It's all the farming on the Yuma area in Arizona. If we get a salad tonight, I can pretty much guarantee you that's where it came from. I mean, just the Arizona side in Yuma is producing 15% of the nation's food, and most of that is the salad production. And then as you go further north in that, we're going to hit the Colorado River and Indian tribes. Clearly a much longer, more historic use. 25% of all of Arizona's Colorado River water is used for agriculture by the Colorado Indian tribes. Michael mentioned the Central Valley of California, clearly outside the basin, but we are doing work there with the public policy needs of California. So again, 1 million acres there has been said, what 500,000 to 1 million acres will need to go out of production to them to meet their stop of groundwater mining goals, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that California, Bruce got Arizona to adopt groundwater management in 1980. California adopted it about 4 years ago. But looking at how are they going to do that, and back to our earlier panel, the idea that some of that use may go to solar is certainly one of the alternative uses of water. But for a classic Lincoln issue, local governments don't really want solar. California has so heavily incentivized solar that it basically pays no property tax. The local government economies will be decimated if they lose agriculture, which pays taxes, and go to solar, which doesn't. I mean, these things can be fixed, but these are the kind of unintended consequences that pop up all over the place when you don't take a comprehensive enough view of what you're doing. I think this is the last one I'll show here. So now what I'm highlighting is the Front Range, the Denver area. So to the south, you see the Arkansas River. Right in the middle of that is Pueblo. So the Bessemer Ditch, Pueblo. What I showed you before, large-scale industrial agriculture. Now we're talking, multi-generation, but small family farms. Some of them may be more hobby farms. But I think 20% of Colorado's agriculture is coming, from this region. And the irrigation district 15 years ago, sorry, not the irrigation district, Pueblo Water serving the city, 15 years ago bought about 20% of the water rights. And it said 20 years from now, we're going to start taking them. Those negotiations are hot and heavy underway, although they may have been delayed some. And And so one of the issues we're looking at there is in the 20% of the land they bought is a lot of the really best prime farmland in the region. And if you're into chili, Pueblo chilies, they're famous for their Pueblo chilies. And you can have an argument whether Hatch chilies or Pueblo chilies are better, but if you're there, it's going to be the Pueblo chili. But there are these mechanisms. If you look at land, prime land, that has sold its water rights and just has a few years left, it might be worth $2,000 an acre. Prime farmland with still its water rates, $12,000 an acre. Marginal land with water rates, $8,000 an acre. You can buy prime land without rights, marginal land with it, swap the water back to the prime land and make money. So you don't just need land trust and foundations to drive this. Land markets can drive that move, and so they're starting to look at issues like that. Just where the big dams are, because we talked about it, Glen Canyon and Lake Powell, Hoover Dam and Lake Mead. And I just wanted to show, well, that was the last slide I wanted to show briefly, because we've talked about, who owns the land. 50% of the land's public, federal, sorry. 20% of the land is Native American tribes. Native American tribes have 20% of the land and about 25% of the water rights. By and large, they're not using that water. They are now getting empowered, the 30 tribes, to start using more of their water at the same time we have less water. So it's creating a very interesting dilemma there. Anyway, we can go ahead and turn those slides off. Maybe I'll stop there for now, and hopefully we'll get more conversation as we go.
All right, no, it's a great place to stop because in Florida we have our own saying, which is in the Everglades, water flows uphill towards money. And so, which also leads to our next panelist, Naveen, who is the CEO of an incredibly innovative company called Terviva, where they're trying to solve this problem in a completely different way by basically through innovation. They've got a new crop. It's called Pangamia. It's drought tolerant. It fixes nitrogen from the air, so it helps solve climate change that way. It's incredibly high yielding. And I was wondering if Naveen, you could talk a little bit about the potential for us to kind of innovate our way out of some of these incredibly intractable problems.
Sure, you bet. Really happy to be here with you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm actually up here in California's Sierra Nevada mountains, which some of you might know, we had a record amount of precipitation here in December. Actually about 17 feet of snow, followed by a record drought, the longest period of lack of precipitation in these mountains on record ever, since records were kept in the 1800s. February is actually the wettest month here in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and we got zero moisture. And as many of you know, the Sierra Nevada mountains provide a huge watershed for a lot of the drinking water that we consume in California. Pardon my dog, who's very eager to get up here with me. So let me first tell you what Terviva does, and then I'll try to provide the context for why we think it matters. So Mike indicated, we grow a novel tree crop. It's called Pangamia. I'm pretty sure none of you have ever heard of it before. Pangamia produces beans that are not too dissimilar from soybeans. So think of it as a soybean tree. Pangamia is a part of a class of crops that I like to call subsistence agriculture crops that are used all around the world by communities, typically on poor quality land, because these trees grow well on poor quality land. The reason why crops like Pangamia have never become big is usually for a couple of reasons. One, they tend to yield erratically. And the second is that they tend to taste a little exotic. They're bitter, or they have a weird color or a weird flavor. So they haven't been able to make their way into center of the plate food. So what Terviva has been able to do is solve those two problems over the last decade. We've shown that when we grow the Pangamia tree on poor quality agricultural land, the kind of land where soybeans would produce 0 tons of beans per acre, we can get 4 tons of beans per acre. The other problem we've solved, again, with significant investment in time, is the taste issue. We've been able to apply modern food processing techniques to effectively, in this case, debitter the Pangamia oil and the protein, and to make it broadly usable in a lot of food applications. So before I tell you more about what's going on in the innovation space, I thought it would be helpful to figure out, why does a company like this even exist? Terviva is about 100 people. We operate in 4 countries. and we've raised over $100 million of private capital to build this business. You might be wondering, well, how is this even possible? Well, if we take a step back and we think about what's happened with agriculture in the last, I'll call it half a century or maybe a little bit more than that, agriculture was solving for three problems in the food system. What I call the A's: abundance, availability, and affordability. A lot of food everywhere for cheap. That is what agriculture was scaled to do. As a result, we tended to put high-intensity crops in places where they probably shouldn't have been, where there's been a scarcity of water and other resources. And importantly, we've tended to only use a handful of crops to meet these needs. We basically industrialized the agriculture system. As Jim and Governor Babbitt were saying, that's come at significant cost. We like to think of agriculture as being impacted by climate change, which is certainly true. Agriculture also contributes to climate change. It is responsible for 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we're now trying to solve for something new in agriculture, right? We're trying to solve for what I describe as resilience, meaning crops that can stand up to climate change. We're trying to solve for mitigation, which means a way to decrease the greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture. And I would argue, many would argue, we're also trying to solve for nutrition, which is something that I think has been neglected in the last sort of 50, 60 years of agriculture, and is now presenting itself to be a problem. So if you put that into context, right, we got to adapt, we got to mitigate, and we've got to kind of grow food a little bit differently. That's why a company like Terviva exists. There's one big X factor here that's really important to discuss before I get into the innovation landscape, which is the consumer. The big pull here that we see in the food and agriculture ecosystem is that consumers are actually embracing the idea of eating for the planet, which is something that, if you'd even told me when I started this business about 10 years ago that would happen, I wouldn't have told you the trend would be as robust as we see it. Many of you have heard of the plant-based foods movement. That is certainly related to the fact that, we can incorporate new and different crops into food, things that people have never heard of, like yellow pea or shiitake fermented brown rice protein or mung bean protein isolate. All these new ingredients are making it to the space. They taste good, but importantly, there's a message that's going out to consumers that if you eat this, it's better for the planet than what you were previously eating. This is a robust trend. Many of you know, in fact, the data came out a couple of days ago that plant-based milks now represent about 16% of the entire dairy category in the United States, right? So the consumer's a real lever here that's pushing through this idea of growing food differently. So if I look at the innovation landscape, what's out there? First, I think there can be a little bit of a misconception that, we're using robots and, cryptocurrency and, AI to do this. That's not exactly what's happening in our space. A lot of this is hardcore applied science meets practical farming. So, for example, in the water space, there's a number of technologies that even we use to manage the efficient irrigation or water maintenance of Pongamia. There are drones, there is satellite imagery, there are dendrograms that you can actually put on trees that will tell you precisely how much water is needed for this crop, right? So there's a whole set of technologies that I call on-farm technologies that are helping growers to adapt how they farm. Of course, if you take a step back, there are a number of companies like Terviva that are innovating on genetics. Sometimes that's exactly the crop that we're growing today, like soy or corn or wheat, and there's iterations of those crops that are being developed. Oftentimes now through what we call non-GMO methods. Sometimes there's a whole new set of crops like Pongamia that are coming into the space that are just biologically different and more advantaged. Finally, if you kind of go further down the value stream, closer toward the consumer, there's a whole new set of technologies that are trying to grow food, not on farmland, but in a different kind of environment. Many of you have heard of indoor vertical farming or controlled environmental agriculture. That whole idea there is that we ought to just not be growing food in certain places where there's water scarcity and there's poor soil quality, where you also have to move that produce a long way to the consumer, which contributes to a lot of food loss. So you have people saying, hey, can we grow it where food is actually also consumed? So it's a pretty robust space. I will say even in the last year and a half, I've seen a lot more adoption of these on-farm technologies to help growers grow more efficiently than I've seen in the last 5-6 years. Again, I'm going to attribute that to the fact that as the consumers care more about how their food is grown, they're putting pressure on the Walmarts, the Targets. We're putting pressure on the Kellogg's and the General Mills of our space, who in turn are going back into the supply chain and saying, hey, look, we need things to be grown differently. I think finally that pressure is actually kind of building back through the agriculture supply chain and really pulling through a lot of these technologies. So I'll stop there and
That's awesome.
hand it over to you, Mike.
That's great. Let me come back to Governor Babbitt. The last time we spent a lot of quality time together. I remember we were on your plane. Maybe it was the government's plane, but we were running around the Klamath Basin, where there was one of those classic fights between farmers, environmentalists, Indian tribes, and they were basically fighting over water. And of course, as always in these fights, the farmers were getting the bulk of the water, and they always do. And politically, they were kind of the bad guys, and they were also the power guys. Now, of course, we have this situation where we're suddenly realizing, like, oh my God, we're going to need a ton of food. You start to think about even the Klamath Basin a little differently, like, what would it mean to take all that farmland out of commission? Can you talk a little bit about how the politics of how you mediate these fights, particularly with agriculture? What are the role of farm politics going to play in this? Because they're a powerful force everywhere.
Mike, it really is all about money when it comes to farm policy. The first issue in the Klamath or elsewhere is, as a practical matter, if you're going to bargain with the farm community about reduction of their historic uses, you've got to accept the political fact that it's got to be paid for. Now, that's an old idea in farm policy. There's nothing new about that, because farmers have been paid to take land out of production for the last 40 years. It's called the Conservation Reserve Program, in which currently the federal government pays farmers to take land out of production to the tune of about, you'll have to check me on this if you're taking notes, I believe the Conservation Reserve now is up to 30 million acres per year. Each year there are 30 million acres out of production in a conservation reserve, paid for by the federal government. Now, that's a really interesting concept, because those lands were taken out because of the concept that there was overproduction, and the land would be left to lie fallow or go out of production. I think what we need in a place like the Klamath or the Colorado Basin is what I would call an irrigation reserve. We have a conservation reserve to take farmland out of production. We should go to Washington and say, to accelerate these transitions, we need an irrigation reserve program paid for by the taxpayers, or alternatively paid for by the hydropower that is generated by all of these dams on the Colorado River. One more thought about farm policy, because this is the place where it all intersects. People say to me, well, how are you going to make up for the 1 million acres that you're paying in a farm program, hopefully, to reduce in the Colorado River Basin? Well, the place to look is right across the mountains to the Middle West Farm Belt, where, for the most part, climate change is going to enable most of that land, with some shifting, to stay in production over the long run. That's 100 million acres of corn production in the Middle West. The 1 million acres that we're taking out of production via climate change is mostly alfalfa and forage for livestock feed in the Colorado River Basin. Where are you going to make that up? Look across the mountain to 100 million acres of Middle West farmland and reflect on another facet of federal policy, which is that 15 million acres of that farmland are growing corn for ethanol production. Can you imagine that? We talk about the need for food production, and we have a federal farm policy which is taking up 15 million acres of prime Middle West farmland to produce ethanol. Now, just to segue out of that, lest I get carried away, that ethanol production, and I want Professor Mumma to listen to this and make sure that I'm on track. The production of corn ethanol adds nothing to climate reduction. Nothing. We're paying farmers to give 15 million acres a year to producing ethanol, which has no climate benefit at all.
Yeah.
I forget your question.
Makes the climate worse. No, it goes right to it. It does. Actually, maybe Jim, you can tackle this too. I mean, right now, you see what's happening in Ukraine. Prices are already starting to go up. If this is a protracted thing, you're going to take another wheat basket out of production. I know right now there's another drought in Africa. I mean, you're going to start hearing people yelling about food prices. How is that, when you sit down at the table to try to negotiate water compacts, and you're telling the ag guys you're going to take their water away? I mean, how is that going to how do you mediate that?
I don't know that there's an easy direct answer to that. A few thoughts I'll share. I think some of these issues are going to be better attached by coming around the corners than head on. So for example, talking to the farmer about him needing to change, he or she, but mostly it's an old him, changing what they're producing is not going to be particularly effective for a variety of reasons. They're heavily indebted. They can't just swap out the equipment that they still owe money on and completely change what they do, and they're doing it the way they've done it for a long time. They're growing the crops they've historically grown. So, the idea that the consumer will come around through the supplier, it'll come around with a different demand. I think that can be part of the puzzle, as we were talking about a minute ago. I think the other thing is, I'll be curious to see how the politics change. I mean, Arizona, I think, would be typical of a lot of states everywhere. State legislators are not really known for being at the forefront of progressiveness in most any state I'm aware of, but certainly not in the Southwest. And so you have urban areas that are going to be up against the wall and are going to needing changes, but their elected representatives have more of an affinity to the farmers and ranchers than they do to the urban populations they actually serve. Push comes to shove, that dynamic is going to change. But at the moment, I would say the agricultural community, the realtors, and the cattle growers have veto authority over anything in the Arizona state legislature. They don't like it, it's not moving. That will begin to shift. Having said that, though, I think a real concern I have with some of these questions we're having is the future of agriculture and the future of agricultural communities is the future of the rural West. I mean, they aren't a major part of the economy in urban areas, but they are the fabric of much of the landscape. And so the changes we're talking about are not trivial. So how do we help them manage those changes? If we're going to be switching to different kind of crops and different kind of technologies, is there a way that there is a revenue stream back to the farmer? And more than the farmer, back to the community. I mean, the deals Bruce was talking about, I think you can probably almost always find a farmer who, for the right price, is willing to sell their water and transfer it. It's the larger community that recognizes what it means for them, what it's going to do to their economy. I mean, we will decimate many rural communities if we don't plan this in a very good way. And one of the biggest challenges we have back to the politics, I guess, is, I mean, I'm a planner. So I would love to get out the maps and the tables and the charts and think about what would be the ideal way we'd make all this work. Well, that's considered socialism by the people who we're trying to affect. Private individuals making private decisions. How do we coordinate that in a way that's going to work for us socially? That to me is the challenge. And I've come back around to really asking the same question you asked me, which I didn't really answer, of how do we get that change to happen?
Well, actually, Naveen, I've heard Naveen talk about sort of the importance of working with farmers and empowering farmers. So since so far, I think the best idea we've got is like maybe we'll move the Iowa caucus like to the end of the line or something, and get rid of ethanol. Naveen, can you give us some miraculous hope?
Yeah, I'm definitely an optimist on this topic. I mean, we obviously operate in the for-profit space. We can't escape policy. Here's our own sort of little case study. The Pongamia tree, it actually, prior to even Terviva being formed, it actually was grown as an ornamental tree in the state of Florida. So when we were thinking about how to begin to scale plantings of this tree that nobody had ever heard of, to Jim's point, it's really hard to get a grower to grow something new. We looked to Florida, where the Pongamia tree previously was, but there was another real important factor that drove the adoption of the tree, which is the collapse of the Florida citrus industry. There's a lot of factors around that. There was about 1 million acres of citrus once in production in Florida about a decade ago. They've lost about 70% of that. One of those factors, which all the growers know there, is the changing weather. The disease that impacts the Florida citrus tree is vectored by an insect that was typically somewhat mitigated by colder weather. They just don't have that colder weather anymore down in Florida. So our growers sort of readily acknowledged in a variety of ways that the climate was impacting their production. We started out pretty basically test plots of trees growing in a bunch of different spots in the state to show growers that the tree would perform well. After that happened, it wasn't enough to immediately tip growers into planting more. We had to engage the policy ecosystem. There are a couple of important facets of policy for any grower. One is just pure regulations. Is your crop sort of legally able to be grown? The second is capital, and the third is crop insurance. So we actually worked on the capital thing right off the bat. Jim talked about lending on farmland. We got the U.S. governmental lender on farmland, Farmer Mac, to come in and actually enable a credit facility for Florida citrus growers who wanted to convert over to Pongamia. So you can now get 50% loan to value on your agriculture land to grow Pongamia in the state of Florida. The USDA also came along with something. They have an existing program called the Tree Assistance Program, the TAP program, which applies to all tree crops in the United States. And there's a special section for Florida citrus. The USDA TAP program is now certified for replacing citrus with Pongamia. And that is, if you're a low-income farmer of citrus in Florida, you can get 75 cents on the dollar back on establishment costs related to growing Pongamia. So I'm an optimist that policy can come along here. I don't think it's easy. I think, again, a lot of the shifting on the policy landscape is because growers are actually going back to the policymakers and saying, I got to do something different. Sometimes that pressure is coming because of crop failure, climate change, markets. In the case of citrus, sometimes it's because the Walmarts and the Krogers of the world are showing up on the farmer's doorstep and saying, you can't grow your orange trees with glyphosate anymore around the trees because it's going into the juice. And even if it's a minimal fraction of that, consumers want to know that there's no glyphosate in their orange juice. So the pressures are there to drive change, Mike. Change is slow, but if you find pockets of what I'll call opportunity, what others might call distress in agriculture, that's where I think you can see change happen more quickly.
Right. Naveen brings us the good news that maybe climate change will destroy entire crops, and then we'll be able to maybe we'll be able to shift. If there are questions from the audience, I'd love to.